Welcome back, everyone, to the TechFlow Futures Theatre and to one of our most important panels of the 3 days of BVE. What we're going to be doing here is really setting the agenda for the TechFlow Futures Theatre, but also, I think, touching on the issues that are setting the agenda for many technology leaders across the industry at the moment. In particular, as we think about how you build technology and operations and workflows for a user-led future, one in which the consumers are very much in charge of how they consume content and what they want and when they want it. How do we start thinking with a mindset that meets consumer needs rather than thinking internally? So I'm certainly looking forward to hearing what is on the to-do list of our three leaders here. So let's introduce them. Florian Diedrichsen is the CTO of DAZN, and if you haven't yet come across DAZN, it's fair to say it's taken the sports world by storm. Florian will probably hate me for saying it's sort of the Netflix of live sports, really taking on the established sports broadcasters by acquiring top-tier sports rights, and instead of broadcasting them on traditional TV, putting them on an OTT platform. So we'll hear about the challenges of building an OTT service that scales up globally and really meets the needs of consumers who have been trained by the big name OTT platforms out there to have very high expectations of how things work. Marina Kalkanis is CEO of M2A Media, and staying with the live content theme, Marina leads M2A, which allows broadcasters and sports rights holders to deliver live content, whether it's live capture, content management and streaming out to consumers. And Marina's working with many big names, including DAZN, but also ITV, UK TV, Sony's Crackle OTT service, and Channel 4, and the BBC, which brings us to Andrew Dunn, who is the technology manager for BBC Studios, which I'm sure you know if you're in the UK, but just to recap, BBC Studios is the production and distribution commercial arm of the BBC. So it now combines all of the in-house production and the commercial operations that used to be known as BBC Worldwide. So what we're going to do is we're going to ask each of our panelists just to give a bit of an overview of their business and where they see the challenges and what's highest on their to-do list this year, and then we'll dive into some of the discussion in a bit more detail. Plenty of opportunity for you to ask questions. We'll have a roving mic, so think of some difficult questions to ask our panelists. And please also share what you're hearing on social media, so you can follow at BV Expo and tweet using hashtag BVE19. Okay, so Florian, tell us a little bit about the challenges of building a global scale OTT platform for sport that has to please consumers, take them away from pay TV and never break down.
Yeah, never break down. That's a very interesting point, actually. There were a few hard learnings. So 3 years ago, we said we have sort of all the tools together to build a global OTT sports service. We have rights, we have data, we have the means of advertising it through our websites. And the only thing which is missing is sort of the OTT service. And said, okay, let's do something which takes Netflix model and transports that into the sports arena, i.e. something where you have one low price, all you can eat, and can get out monthly, which is obviously a quite different paradigm than what you see in standard pay TV operators. And that also takes us to the user-led product, because if you can get out monthly, you don't have the luxury of sitting there for 2 years and waiting for the customer to pay for you and maybe sort of get used to what you do. No, you need to get it right from the beginning. And that's actually quite hard to do, because I mean, if you look at the world of OTT streaming and Netflix, which is sort of a staple food of the cord cutter by now, that's a relatively well understood paradigm by now. While live streaming is a completely different kettle of fish, especially if you do what we do, which is not just a 24/7 channel where you essentially put some fragments out and you don't have time shift and rewind. No, with us you can jump back through the whole of the event which you are watching. We are also spinning up channels, events as they come along. So Monday morning we have nothing going on, and on a Saturday we suddenly have 50 events going on, which is good and bad. This is one of the big advantages we have at the zone, that we show all the rides. If you look at Japan, for example, just dropped off a plane from Tokyo this morning. That's if I'm a bit tired, please excuse me. We are showing all the games of J1, J2, J3, okay? That's 3 leagues. It gives us a concurrency in Japan alone of about 18 games at once, which is something which never happened before. A classical pay TV operator obviously has a few transponders in the sky, and then he assigns his content to it and has a limited amount of channels of content he can show. We do it differently. Again, user-led. That's what we perceive our users to want, by the fans, for the fans. And yeah, we made it happen over 3 years. Again, a lot of hard lessons to learn in the process, but I mean, we're quite successful. We streamed, I think, 250 million hours of content last year, 25,000 events, so quite a lot of work there.
Oh, and what's the hardest part? Is it getting the back end right so that we don't get a spinning wheel when somebody's about to score a goal, or is it getting the usability and the interaction that your customers have with the app right, the whole process,
Both,
and making it no friction?
So there's multiple things. First and foremost, you can't have a spinner as such. If people get rebuffering, then obviously in sports where you don't get a second chance, that is a definite no-no. But a secondary problem there is we aim to be on about 95% plus of devices in market. And that means you have a lot of different clients which are old and new, very really old legacy stuff which we have to support, Xboxes One, things like that. Means that we have to do 3 different packages. We still need to support Smooth, for example, which is no fun, HLS Dash, so 3 different packages which we do in 8 different bit rates. And then obviously the user experience itself, while I would still say we are sort of in the minimum viable product stage, is very important. I mean, if for example the conversion funnel doesn't work, you get people on the site, but the actual sign-up process is too convoluted and the conversion ratio isn't right, then you have a big problem. And getting these things right and sort of getting the maximum use of the money which you spend for marketing, converting people, and then obviously keeping them is very hard, and yeah, that's what we are up to do.
So as a CTO then, does that require a very different mindset from perhaps what a traditional broadcast or post-production CTO would have? What is the different approach that you need to take?
I mean, we have a way closer interaction with the customer than a classical broadcaster would have. Classical broadcaster obviously sort of looks at how many people watch, and that's obviously more an art than a science in many ways. We see it directly. We can see how our customers interact with the product, how many things they watch, when they watch them, how they watch them, what the split between live, non-live is. And one of the most important things for us is really customer interaction. We know that somebody who watches 2 to 3 games a month doesn't churn. So how do we actually present the content which is available to people? How do we figure out what they really want to see, what fan they are? What do we do if you have somebody like who's, let's say, a Premier League fan, Premier League season stops, then there's the long summer where nothing is happening. We need to identify content to keep these people engaged, otherwise they will churn. And as it's easy with us to churn, which I think is actually an advantage of our product, we need to figure out how we get him interested in tennis or motorsports or another league, so that he stays on and obviously pays.
Now, Marina, it wasn't that long ago that people said, oh, you'd never be able to do live sports on OTT platforms, there's too much latency, it's not reliable enough, nobody will ever put up with that. Obviously that's changed, and partly that's down to some of the technology that you've been able to develop that's not only used by DAZN, but all the UK broadcasters and beyond. What is it that's so difficult about live, and how are you able to solve that problem?
So the thing that's very difficult about live, of course, is that you don't have any chance to prepare it ahead of time, and you don't really, there's no opportunity to fail. So people can't, like, if it buffers, it's not like, oh, well, I'll just watch that, when it comes back. You've missed it. So the thing about live is it's got to be right in the moment, and there's nothing that you can do well, there's lots you can do, but if it's not right in the moment, you can't recover from that. And that's the hardest thing. One of the things that Florian was talking about is traditional broadcasters did live streaming on hardware. And the biggest thing that's hard about doing live streaming OTT is you're now doing it in software. And software is not like hardware, right? So hardware, you put it together, you test it, and pretty much, unless the actual device fails, it's going to do exactly what it was intended to do every single time you start it up. Software is just, as we know, is a completely different kettle of fish, right? And so what's happening is that it's software right through the chain, and everything is changing, right? The software is changing in the clients, the software is changing, right the way through the stack. Everything's interconnecting with each other, but there's so much possibility for change, right? It's the advantage, because of course that's what makes it interesting for the users, that you're not giving them this experience that you built and that's the way it's going to be for the next 10 years. You're giving them an experience that can change on a daily basis to meet their needs. But actually making that change happen and giving them a great experience is incredibly challenging. So there's so many, it's almost impossible at any point in time to know that you haven't got something in your system that could go wrong. And so you have to be in a position to be able to know exactly how you're, watch your system and see how it's behaving and react to it in real time. So it's, there's a lot of data that goes into it. There's a lot of operations that goes into it. There's a lot of resilience. There's the ability to try things out in smaller areas and have parallel type services running but slightly different and roll things through that way. But a lot of challenges.
And your technology largely runs in the cloud. One complaint I often hear from people using the cloud is it can often be a bit of a black box when it comes to knowing what's going on in there. So how do you get that balance of keeping that tight monitoring to maintain the quality of services like DAZN with the fact that you don't always have great control over what's happening in cloud infrastructure?
Well, you do. I mean, I think that there's a bit of a misnomer. I mean, obviously you don't own the hardware, and so you have reliance on the supplier of the cloud. It's absolutely true. But cloud technologies are at the forefront of the kind of monitoring that they offer is just standard in the stack. So you've got quite a lot of ability, and you have to build stuff with that in mind, that you're putting those metrics into your system and doing all that kind of data gathering and data analysis as you go along. It's absolutely critical. I think cloud actually makes live streaming at this kind of scale possible with the degree of change that you want to be able to offer to your user community, because you can leave a system running and then try something new in a new with new instances, right? You don't have to replace things to get new, if you know what I mean.
And so the fact you're a relatively young company and effectively were able to start with a clean sheet, did that make a difference that you were able to really
Absolutely.
do things in a new way right from the outset?
Absolutely. So the other thing you want to do when you're doing, everyone talks about stateless. I mean, I think for live it's absolutely critical, because as Florian said, you're going to go from no events to, possibly up to 100, not quite, but maybe 100 when you think about all the regions, concurrence. But you're also going to go from, maybe just a few thousand to up to 1 million active viewers, right? So you've got to have that kind of scale that you wouldn't have. It'd be extremely wasteful to build all of that. And then, of course, you'll have constraints. So it's absolutely.
Florian.
I mean, just intersect here. So we obviously, with Perform, used to be a classic content provider. And to that end, we had a lot of encoders for our betting business on-prem. And our average usage on those is about 10%. And that's incredibly wasteful, okay? So what we are doing with M2A here in the cloud enables us to do what we do with DAZN. It wouldn't work if you had hardware on-prem.
Interesting. Now, Andrew, you've kind of facing that same challenge in that, unlike these guys, the BBC's been around a while, so you do have a lot of legacy operations and processes and technology. Of course, you have to keep the traditional content production for linear TV and operating commercial TV stations around the world going, while also adapting to this new world and launching new digital services. So how do you bring all of that together?
I think the key thing for us at the moment is around making sure that we create the content at the point of production that meets the needs of our customers, whether that's the end consumer or the intermediate broadcaster, OTT service, what have you. So one of the big things we're looking at the moment is the idea of IMF and componentizing our content. Rights, as Florian was talking about earlier, is a really important thing. Making sure that we've got the right rights for the right piece of content in the right territory. In some cases, for example, big natural history productions like Dynasties that recently, we actually had 20 original versions of Dynasties for different rights cases around the world. So some of them had David Attenborough voice over, some of them didn't. Some of them had David Attenborough in vision, and some of them didn't. They had different music, they had different branding. But all of those things we had to create in production. We had to QC them all, and we had to store them all and deliver them all. So the idea of componentizing is we can chop those up, because 95% of all of those versions are identical. But all the variants, in a traditional workflow, we have to QC the whole thing end to end. In a componentized workflow, you just QC the changes, and you just deliver the changes. So it makes a huge difference. And that's, it can be automated. It sits in the cloud. So that's kind of one of the big things we're looking at the moment.
And thinking about the way your business has evolved, thinking to the sort of BBC Worldwide model, where it was very much a B2B business. You were selling content and distributing channels to other broadcasters. How much of a change has there been in the sort of internal mindset and the way of thinking? Now you're thinking maybe more about the audience and the consumer, and operating in a way that's going to meet their needs.
So we that model still exists. We still are a B2B business, but we do have direct to consumer offerings. We used to, we still do have a very profitable direct to consumer physical product sale market. People are still buying DVDs, and we make a very healthy profit off that every year. But we also have our own branded streaming services. So M2A are helping us with BritBox in the US, which is a JV with ITV. We also have BBC Player in the Asian market. So but we are targeting our direct consumer offerings. We have a channels business around the world. So there are BBC branded channels across Europe, South Africa, Australia. So we are offering. It's all about knowing what the audience wants, and we'll offer different services in different markets depending on what the audience is looking for.
So Florian, let's go back to thinking about the architecture theme. When you set out to create DAZN, you had, as you said, you had to build this huge, reliable, scalable platform that would work 100% of the time around the world. How did you go about that? Did you develop it all in-house? Did you buy existing components from providers like Marina? A bit of both. Were you able to bring in Silicon Valley sort of methodologies to how you worked with product teams and development? Just take us sort of inside the process a little bit.
So actually the first version of the product was about 21 providers, which we cobbled together in a bit of a haphazard fashion, I have to say, because we had to get it off the ground in, originally we thought it would be 4 months. In the end it was more like 7 months. And the only way to do that, as we also had to build a lot of the production in the background, was by using a lot of suppliers. So we focused from a perform perspective more on getting our fiber ring around the world and production centers in Munich and Tokyo, right? Then building the actual software, also the metadata layer, which is also quite important in what we are doing here. Now, we are currently replacing everything with our V2 application, which is more of a global product, where we run all the catalogs in the same setting and all the customers in the same setting. This is some sort of classic microservices, which we run on AWS mostly at the moment. which scales very well horizontally. Where we can, we employ serverless, as that is something which I like very much. It gives you a way better relationship from customer to actual operational cost, as you only run your software when it's really needed and pay per access. And we also have done something new, which not that many people have done. We are building our micro front ends, as we call them, which is a similar approach in the sense that we have a microservice-like components of the front ends which we bind together at runtime per customer, based on the device the customer uses, the market he is in, and the features he needs. And that scales very well, gives us very small downloadable content, very quick startup times. Works very well for us.
Now I'm going to assume that not everyone here is a cloud architect expert, so just explain a little bit more about some of the terms you've used there, particularly serverless and microservices and APIs. How does that come together to do something different from the traditional way of building a solution?
So traditional solutions are generally monolithic pieces of code where all the functions that you want your software to do reside in one big piece of code. The advantage is obviously that this is in a way more efficient in running it and communicating between the different aspects of your code. The problem is you can't scale it very well, especially across sort of servers, because you always run the whole set of software, even though you might only have to scale up your sign up or your playback or whatever it is. So if you do microservices, what you try to do is that you split your software up into different services. These services are all self-contained, and not only self-contained in the sense that you, let's say, have a block of code which does sign up, but then you can have multiple sign-up services sitting next to each other, which have all the components which you need at runtime, including, for example, the database layer. So then you can spin them horizontally as much as you like, and you have essentially, apart from obviously limitations on network and availabilities of instances in the cloud, no limitations on the size of your stack. Now, for somebody like us, that's obviously great, because if you think of what we are doing in the US, for example, we are sort of replacing pay-per-view with a subscription model, which means that we are converting millions of people from paying for a single fight into paying for a subscription. That also means that if you have a big fight, we have Canelo, for example, it's one of the biggest boxers in the States. If you have a fight in the evening, then you might have a few million people signing up, okay? If you have a few million people signing up, that's not the normal use case. So you want to spin out your stack specifically for sign up for this requirement that evening, and then be able to spin it down again, and that's something which you can do with microservices. Now, serverless is sort of an extension of the paradigm in the sense that if you look at AWS, I don't know who's familiar with AWS here. Okay, it's probably worthwhile to explain it anyway. Then it's not the majority. So AWS started out in providing essentially resources, computing resources, to their customers. So you could buy computers or instances, virtualized computers, and that means then you take a computer, you say, okay, Amazon, I'd like 3 instances of that type, then you install your software on them, and you connect them to the internet, etc., and then hopefully your stuff runs. Now, serverless is the extension of this principle where you don't buy an instance anymore. You just say, here's my software, Amazon, run it, and give them sort of a rough idea how much load you might have on it, but essentially don't care about the underlying resources, instances, whatever, anymore at all. And you then only pay per instantiation, per call of the software, which is obviously a great model.
So Andrew, I guess at the BBC you inherited quite a lot of old school tech and these big existing monolithic systems that you can't just get rid of because that would be very expensive and time consuming. So how do you kind of build these modern architectures that Florian's described at the same time as keeping the show on the road?
Well, it's the BBC so slowly is one of the most important things. We don't do anything quickly in the BBC. But actually it's really nice to work with smaller, more agile startups who've, they can do things that we would take us years to come up with and do ourselves. So being able to buy into small services just to do one thing really well is something we're beginning to kind of steer ourselves towards doing. It used to always be that we would go and we would buy a complete system and service from a provider, and we're beginning to move away from that, and we're looking towards smaller services and buying the best of breed from different suppliers.
Now, Marina, we talked about cloud earlier, and it's almost as if these things have happened in parallel. This focus on delivering content directly to consumers and making a great experience at the same time as using some of these new technology paradigms that become available because of the cloud. So is the cloud a kind of prerequisite to deliver a consumer-led operation, a consumer-led architecture, or is it just that they kind of complement each other rather nicely?
You could argue it's not a prerequisite. I think that, but what it offers is such an advantage that it'd be very difficult to not take advantage of it, if you see what I mean, and still stay in the game. There's quite a good example that I could use with the BBC. Last year, the BBC had the opportunity through BritBox to put the royal wedding out to the United States, but there were some caveats around that because they couldn't use the same production that was being fed to the television stations because that was already licensed in the United States to American television stations. They had the opportunity, BritBox is a JV between the BBC and ITV, they had the opportunity to put the ITV coverage onto BritBox because that wasn't licensed. And this is a perfect cloud opportunity. We could stand something up in the cloud where we could collect a feed from ITV, process it exactly in the way that the BBC does their processing, and feed it into a service that thought it was getting a sort of standard BBC feed, if you like, and you could do all that for a day, if you see what I mean, and then shut the whole thing down again when you're done. It'd be very difficult to do something like that if you didn't have access to cloud resources. You'd be spending most of your time, opening crates and unpacking boxes and things like that. And who wants to be doing that sort of stuff? Yeah.
And you may be biased on this, but how important do you think live content is going to be in the coming years as the quote-unquote traditional media companies and broadcasters try to compete with the digital competitors like DAZN that are kind of starting to eat into their territory? And I know, for example, you did work with ITV on formats like Love Island that was actually a great success in attracting an audience that people were starting to think maybe had been lost from live linear TV.
Well, so I think as the trend starts to increase from sort of cord cutting and going away from pay TV and more to online services, there was a lot of content in pay TV that was kind of filler content. It was all VOD. It was all pre-produced, lots of files, and it just was out there, and it was like what a lot of television was. And I think now when people are moving away from that, they want stuff that's really exciting, and that's live, right? So if you have the opportunity to watch, something that's a pre-recorded cooking show or something live, I mean, and it's all available to you, why wouldn't you go to the live thing, right? What's interesting, I think, for live as well is it also starts to change. There's quite a lot of capacity now for live, given the cloud and given, IP production and things like that. Starts to change things as well. How do you make live exciting? How do you bring in, the formats that are, people are talking now about the vertical formats, et cetera, right?
Yeah.
Do you see what I mean? How do you make all of these things really relevant to people and go those next steps, right?
Yeah.
I think that's the interesting bit, isn't it?
And keeping with this sort of link between the digital world and the broadcast world, Florian, your latest project is building a new facility in Leeds, which is, I guess, a bit of a content factory for managing all of the content that you're creating and putting out on your channels. Is that just going to be like any other broadcast facility, or are you using some of the things you've learned from building out digital platforms in terms of how you run a content operation?
Yeah, that's a very good question, actually. So one of the biggest problems which we are facing is that at the moment we are in 9 markets with DAZN. We want to be in 20 markets next year, and we have to localize content. And that obviously, in a traditional way, means that you take a signal, let's say Bundesliga, put it through our fiber ring into Japan, do Japanese commentary, do Japanese graphics, take it back, encode it, which means you multiply sort of your rights per market, and that actually isn't a very efficient model. So what we're trying to do is centralized production where we only take the video and multiple audio streams through to final encoding and then send them around to the end user, do the graphics locally on the client, and sort of only produce a secondary stream which is a neutralized backup, if you want to call it that. I mean, there's some problems around smooth and so on and so forth. Don't want to bore you with that. Anyway, to that end, we need a fully digital facility which can do that, which can monitor these streams, which can make sure that the graphics informations go out at the right time, that the markers for stings, promos, advertisements are in there at the right time, and all these things. Now, we have been working with fully digital video for about 5, 6, 7 years now, so that's not new for us. But at the same time, we are trying to take as many of the old broadcast paradigms, which are proven and time-tested, if you so want, into the digital world as we can. Because at the end of the long day, we have a customer sitting at home who switches on a device, his television, whatever, and wants to see sports. Okay? And it needs to be there. You don't get a second chance with sports. It needs to happen. And television has been very good in making that happen, obviously in a completely different realm. But if you can transport a few of the ways of how this is done, from rundowns to essentially people pressing buttons in a configuration which is similar to what you did in a classical television setting, then that's surely a good thing.
And it's interesting how similar your problems are there with what Andrew described. You're versioning football for multiple countries in real time. You're versioning David Attenborough documentaries.
Well, we have a similar issue. It's not live, but the idea of creating global moments, with big dramas. We did it with Doctor Who a few years ago. HBO does it quite regularly with Game of Thrones. The idea of getting that piece of content out in all markets simultaneously, it's similar challenges to live. You don't have the same time pressures and the latency issues, but being able to get all of those languages localized. We did Doctor Who, the 50th anniversary. We did that simultaneously transmitted in 96 territories, and it was localized appropriately for every one of them. And it's being able to do that. We wouldn't have been able to do it. And this was 5-6 years ago now, but we wouldn't have been able to do that without some agile providers.
Now we have a session coming up later in BVE here where we're going to be looking at quality versus convenience, which is the trade-off between the kind of focus on ever better pixels and HDR and 8K and UHD and the audio that goes on with it, and the convenience of getting that content into consumers' hands on their device at the right moment. And a lot of what we've been talking about today has, to my mind, been very much focused on that convenience aspect, getting a great experience in the hands of a consumer at the right moment. Andrew, is that the case for you at BBC Studios, or are you also investing in 8K content and HDR?
HDR, yes. 8K from an acquisitions point of view, yes. From a distribution point of view, not at the moment. 4K UHD, yes, but actually the big benefits of UHD are actually the HDR. If you were to put an HD screen and a UHD screen this size, and somebody standing at the back there, you wouldn't be able to tell the difference with the resolution. But if you have high dynamic range versus a standard dynamic range, you'd be able to see that quite clearly. So HDR is very important to us. We are obviously with BBC R&D hat on, very much focused on HLG as a format, as opposed to PQ and Dolby Vision and HDR10 Plus and all of those other things, which are all variants on a theme.
But with all of this, doesn't it really depend on consumer devices, and is it maybe out of your hands because it's really in Samsung and LG's control anyway?
They all support HLG, funnily enough.
The point being, until consumer devices are in the market readily enough that supports this, and the consumers have a mechanism that gets them that content, it doesn't matter what you're making because no one can watch it.
There is, to a certain extent, yes. That is, but we are trying to make the best quality content possible with a look at the long tail. The content that we make lasts for decades in some cases. So making it as good as we can now, so that it will look as good as it can into the future is what we want to do.
And from the OTT perspective, when you guys are delivering live content over OTT, this sort of shift towards 4K and 8K must come as a bit of a concern, because you've just got it working now with the minimum latency to make live sports work, and now all of a sudden we want to quadruple the number of pixels flowing through your pipes. Is that going to cause it all to grind to a halt?
I'm with Andrew there, because HDR is definitely on the in the future for us. That's a bit for me like the shift from SD to HD. Immediately much better. 4K, 8K, God, that is nice manufacturing, really. They're obviously pushing very hard for it. On the back of that content, they can sell the new devices. I mean, this is obviously a bit of an egg. Nobody produces content, you can't sell the device. Nobody produces content. So somebody needs to make the first step. On the first productions, UHD with HD now works. We are upgrading our backbone. The higher bandwidth needed. But are we going to do it sort of? Or surely not. Probably select games, maybe select leagues this year, and then we'll see what comes.
Now I'm going to take some questions from you guys shortly, so if you would like to ask or all of them a question, hand up. Nigel will come to the microphone. While you're doing that, I'm just going to ask one more question to all panelists. We've seen, along with the shift towards a consumer focus and also using more modern cloud architectures to deliver that, the theme that I've heard from all of you is shifting from a national mindset to a global one. You're all talking about distributing content on a global basis, and therefore the need to scale to deliver on a huge scale. Particular challenges there, or is it something that's dead simple in cloud and you don't worry about it?
So it's not dead cloud, of course, because in fact, actually, even not every single thing in cloud is exactly the same. Just basic things like that. But getting beyond that, it's not the real challenge. The challenge is that regions are quite different, and so the way the network will work, the way the distribution works in one region is quite different to another, and so you have to take that into account when you're building a service for that region, and then you get into the regional type issues. So there's definitely quite a lot to factor in, how you'll source the content, and of course there's also that you from a cloud perspective, you want to make sure that everything's resilient, so you can't just map a global a region in the world to a kind of cloud region either, because that's going to leave you completely exposed. So there's just so many different factors that will sit there.
And do you think all broadcasters, all media companies will just have to go global in order to stay in business and compete and amortize the costs of building out all of this technology and these platforms on a big enough market? Do you see that as the future? I mean, you're already all global anyway, but what's the future for a national broadcaster?
I think it probably does depend on the region they're in. In some regions, very focused local content is absolutely what that region's interested in. In others, the UK, we are very much interested in looking out at everything around the world. So I think it is very much region dependent.
Yeah,
great.
I think
sorry, go ahead, Florian, then we'll ask some.
The biggest problem from my point of view is, I mean, we obviously from a rights perspective and from a distribution perspective, we want to be global and we are global, but the biggest problem is really distribution. The back-end systems is not where the heavy lifting happens in the end. The heavy lifting happens in getting the video to the customer, and that is a problem which is centered around last mile connectivity, ISPs, CDNs, and then to a degree origins, but then you can scale relatively well. And That is probably the biggest obstacle for OTT as a whole. If you go, say, into South America, we're just going into Brazil, and if you look at the average bandwidth to the home there, then it's a completely different kettle of fish than, let's say, in Germany or in Japan. And as long as you don't have, let's say, 10 megabits plus into each and every home, having blanket OTT will be hard.
Interesting. So again, thinking about it from the consumer's perspective and what they're connected to is critical in terms of building back your architecture. Yeah. Good. Do we have any questions? You have the rare opportunity of a stellar panel of experts here. So please, if you've got questions, put your hand up. Be brave. I know you're in a big room full of people. Do we have a question there? Just let us know who you are, what organization you're from, and then ask away with the question.
Hi, I'm is it good? I'm Alexander Breedy with Sentient, and I'm curious about in this new modern architecture how advertising has changed and whether we should be able to expect advertising to be like we see it on the internet, where it's targeted to the individual, or whether it's still like more geographic regions.
Yeah.
Do you want the long or the short version? So, yes, advertisement is going to be personalized, because in the end, this is the internet and this is an OTT service, and why wouldn't you personalize like you do it on YouTube or whatever? Of course, again, in a live environment, that's probably a bit harder than it is in a static file-driven environment. But yes, we're going to do that.
Yeah. Marina, are your clients delivering live ads, and if so, are they addressable, replaceable ads?
They're certainly looking at it. Yes, absolutely. Because it's part of what a live service needs to offer is addressable ads, custom, personalized ads.
And for your content, Andrew, when you're distributing commercial content?
So at the moment, all of this, our commercial offerings are subscription. So then we don't carry advertising on those, or they are traditional linear advertising driven.
There's a whole other debate to be had, I guess, about advertising versus subscription and where that lies. Any questions further? One in the front here. Again, just let us know where you're from and fire away with the question.
Hello, Rob McGann from BBC Children's. There's a proliferation of OTT providers, lots of people vying for attention, and in a world where that is on lots of different devices without a television where effectively the EPG listed all my options, how are people going to discover all these different great content destinations, and how are you going to vie for attention between these different platforms when basically they're everywhere?
That's a very, very good question. I think there is room here for an aggregator and an agent play, where you can provide this service to people and essentially aggregate all the content providers on your platform, and then do personalized rails, or however you want to offer it, for the customer, or have an agent where you sit down in front of your television at night and the agent says, it's you and your girlfriend, therefore the romance here, you alone, a football game might be the right thing. That hasn't happened yet. There's a few people who try to do it, sort of. Amazon with channels, obviously, is probably one of the big contenders in the marketplace and might come out on top there. Apple is doing something around it, but there's a plethora of smaller companies who are also trying to enter the market space. But yeah, it will definitely be needed.
And
Obviously Amazon is, has that family of, effectively apps within there. Becomes that kind of, that almost that broadcaster as a platform. Do you see someone ultimately winning out in that world?
let me paraphrase your question so that people can hear, because the mic didn't get to you. I guess the question is, with an app-focused platform like an Amazon Fire TV, does that become the aggregator? In fact, if you're BBC Studios, do you want Amazon or Google owning that customer relationship when you think about the user-led future?
It's a really difficult. It's a really difficult thing, and I think this is going to be an issue for consumers across the world. Subscribing to multiple services is finding that content. So discoverability of content is really difficult. as is attribution of content. You know, we as the BBC want to make sure that people know that we made this really good content. So that's a really tricky thing to do. But yeah, I think having a universal search function across either a set-top box or a smart TV, being able to search multiple services simultaneously and then just bringing the content you want from whichever provider that you subscribe to, I think is potentially the future.
Now we're about out of time. Add to that briefly if you can, yeah.
It's a very double-edged sword from my point of view. There is a danger that somebody emerges as the gatekeeper to all content, and you obviously don't want that. On the other hand, it's a big opportunity for people who have smaller, not that important rights to get this content in front of a large audience. So, we'll see.
So we're out of time, but I want to ask each of you for your sort of 10-second final take on, as you think about the year ahead and what's on your to-do list and where your priorities lie, what are the most important things when it comes to architecting for a user-led future? What do you need to do to really please those consumers that you're making and delivering content for? So I'm going to put Andrew on the spot first, having given them no time to think about this answer.
I think for us it's working with productions, particularly to deliver componentized content, moving towards a sort of IMF way of working, rather than, all of that, I was talking about QCing, all of that stuff adds time to the production process. If we can scale that down, it means that the productions have more time to deliver what they need to, or ideally they deliver things sooner.
Marina?
For us, it's about having all the right tooling and data and monitoring and having services that are really quick to deploy, resilient, scalable. Just make it, just do exactly the right things at the right moment for whatever is our customers' needs.
Scaling the zone into quite a few additional markets, and at the same time adding groundbreaking features which make a real difference to our audience.
Great. And just to let you know, staying with sport at 12:15, so 15 minutes time, come back here when we'll be looking more on sport, and in particular how AI-powered smart content cataloging, so using AI to look through content and classify it, can start to transform the experience for sports fans. So that's up next, but in the meantime, please do help me in thanking our panelists, Florian Diedrichsen from DAZN, Maria Kalkanis from M2A, and Andrew Dunn from BBC Studios.